objection? that we can. Can everybody hear me? I don't know if we can see in the chat. Does everybody hear me okay? Can everybody see me? Just want to make sure that things are working okay. Okay, everyone can hear me. That's good, because I can't hear you all or see you all. Of course, I can't see you, but I can't really hear much of the audio. I would like to welcome you to this special episode. Of course, as we know, the war in Iran is still raging, and there's a lot of talk about the possibility of a ground invasion that's imminent. We have the Marines on the way. We have the 82nd Airborne Division on the way. There's been talk of special operators of the 75th Ranger Regiment. So there's a lot of concern here about what's going on. But what I would like to do is I'd like to bring in two prominent guests. Our first guest tonight needs no introduction, but of course I will love to introduce him. He's, of course, a former U.S. representative, a physician, an author, an activist in his own right, Dr. Ron Paul. Let's bring him onto the stage. And it's a pleasure. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Chris.
Wonderful. Wonderful. I can hear you too. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to see you.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Good to be here with you. I want to ask you, the first question is your general opinions, your impressions, what you feel right now as we enter into yet another what seems like an endless war in the Middle East. What are you thinking these days?
Well, I'm thinking is the best word I know is a bunch of mush. Nobody knows what's going on. Everybody pretends they know something. Everybody makes predictions. Everybody knows who the good guys and the bad guys are. And I put a lot of blame on the foreign policy of the United States, because we use an interventionist foreign policy, and we have an empire, and we interfere too often around the world. We stir up trouble, and it leads to a lot of disasters and too many wars, too many people dying, too much spending, too much inflation. It's all related to financing these illegal, unconstitutional, immoral wars that we so carelessly get involved in.
You're absolutely right. Now, you were in Congress during the so-called war on terror, and you were a powerful voice against that involvement, that quagmire that not only took the lives of young men and women in uniform, but also took the treasure of the American people to the tune of trillions of dollars. Tell us right now, what are you thinking economic-wise? There's a lot of questions about Strait of Hormuz, the questions around the economic impact that this is going to have. You've been a forceful voice on economic issues, especially on the Fed and many other dimensions of U.S. Economic policy. What are you thinking now?
Well, that question came up during the campaigns that I was in and the debates, because they talked about, there were two things. You could talk about economic policy, and we would discuss that, or we could talk about foreign policy. But you can't talk about foreign policy without talking about economic policy, because you still have to steal a lot of money from the people to fight the wars and fight a war that's undeclared. So they mesh together. So it's not unusual for people to believe you have a war, you have inflation. And there's a lot of reasons why prices go up. But the main thing is we don't have any money. So we just print the money to the tune of trillions of dollars, or a debt by $38 trillion now. And since we don't have the money, but we have a special tool. We have the reserve currency of the world. And there will be a day when it's weak enough where we won't be able to spend it and dump it on the rest of the world. So far, they're willing to take it. And so far, we're competitive because the other countries don't have much in the tune of a sound currency. But anyway, it's working for a while, but eventually it all ends badly, because empires always overreach, and generally they always print too much of their own money and destroy the value of the money. And we're at that point, and I think it's very clear that a few more minor changes in our economic policy will all of a sudden do the correct thing. No, I think that we've spent so much in these last, 10, 20, 30 years, and we've built up these huge deficits that it will have to be corrected by liquidation. Liquidation means that if you or I or somebody else had a debt too high and we weren't having an income, we couldn't even pay our interest, eventually we go bankrupt. And that's what's going to happen to us. But it's different in the sense that our government, when you have a reserve currency of the world, you don't have to go bankrupt because you can keep printing the money. The closest thing to our bankruptcy was August 15th, 1971, when we went beyond our means and we pretended that we had a strong currency because we backed it by our gold at $35 an ounce, which was a farce. And finally, the market said, no, we're not going to keep doing this. The French led the charge against that foolishness. And so the markets will dictate eventually. And then all the stupid mistakes, whether they were foreign policy or social spending and all the thing called debt, but also malinvestment, because this messes up the interest rates, and interest rates is a key to the cost of money. So it's it's a cost control. It's a wage and price controls are bad, and prices are controlled. When you control the price of interest, you just encourage all this malinvestment, all the debt. But what I'm saying is, it's going to collapse, and just going to war to stay out of deepening your recession or depression. It doesn't work, hasn't worked in the past. It's usually a sign that bad times are ahead.
So would you characterize the US now as sort of a late stage empire? You made reference to that, and I would see it that way. What do you think about that?
Well, what is that again you said about?
Would you consider the U.S. to be an empire in its later stages, a late stage empire?
Yeah, I call it an empire all the time. It's a little bit different than some empires, but no, we're in charge. We threaten people, and we intimidate people. We pay them to be obedient, and if they don't do exactly what we say, we bomb them and kick them out of the empire. No, we have an empire, and and we really have had coups in this country too, because if you're too strongly anti-war and you're in the government, you can be in big trouble. And in the 60s, and I was very much aware of what was going on in the 1960s, because I ended up being drafted at that time. So but what did they do with the leaders? I mean, Kennedy changed his mind on Vietnam, so he was assassinated. Robert Kennedy was assassinated. Martin Luther King was assassinated. And now we have assassinations still going on, and there's always a question mark. And that's the way empires work. And the one thing is about an empire, truth is treason. If you tell the truth in an empire of lies, it never works. Truth is destroyed, and the people who tell the truth, they're the ones who get in trouble.
I think you're absolutely right. One of the other things that I've been thinking, especially about you these days, because I followed your work for many years, and you had an inspiring presidential run. And it certainly, as a young person, during the activist phase, when I was protesting against the Iraq war, it was very important in that time period that you were a voice for reason at a time when it seemed that this kind of jingoistic fervor had taken over the country. I want to ask you about this recent developments related to the Strait of Hormuz, which I think impact economic policy, which is the dollar tied as a reserve currency, the dollar tied with petroleum, and now Iran saying, for example, we're not going to settle any of these transactions in US dollars, we're going to switch to yuan, the Chinese currency. So I'm wondering, what do you make of the currency transformations we're seeing globally, and how do you think it'll impact the US after this?
That sort of fits into my opening statement, that you can't have foreign policy and militarism on one side and economic policy over here, because they're combined. And you mentioned oil and the prices going up. Well, there's the spending and the monetizing of the debt, and you have the conventional understanding of inflation by just printing too much money. But at the same time, we're spending it, and the world has trusted us in our dollar. So we get involved and we throw our weight around and we think we can run the world and dictate to the world. And of course, we end up with a mess like this. And it's not going to be reversed easily. People say, well, that's why we need more members in Congress. We need more, Thomas Massey's, and we've got to get them in and change. It's not going to happen that way. We need people like that. We need them desperately to speak out the truth. But just look, Massey speaks out the truth, and he's one of Trump's enemies. Trump just goes after him like he's the problem. he's the answer. So that is the big problem. But here you have the economic problems, the oil problems, and already, we see extreme changes. I'm amazed that it's not worse, but it will get worse because we're not changing anything. And why it gets worse, it turns into more violence because this system punishes a group of people and a group gets benefit. A top 10% of the people do pretty well under these circumstances. And the people in the lower 50 or 60%, they suffer the most because even though they may get token pay raises, they never can keep up with the devaluation of the currency. And they have to fight the wars. And here we are, just again, they started drafting forcibly, automatically, signing up for the draft. So they're preparing for this. So it's not only an economic issue and a foreign policy issue. It's one of the biggest things is a personal liberty issue because people lose their liberties under these conditions. It's been notorious even throughout our history, dating back to the early history of the wars that we fought in the 19th century.
I think that's a major concern. You were in Congress and you were involved in political life at a time when, after 9/11, we had the introduction of the Patriot Act. We had a slow erosion of people's personal and civil liberties, and that's been a very big concern of mine. Of course, as a person who's involved in the activism that I am and in the journalism that I do, traveling to places that the U.S. doesn't like, for example, Yemen or Lebanon or the Donbass region. That Russia has now integrated into its federation. I've been subjected to, CBP. I've been subjected to the FBI coming to the house, a raid, and all of these things. And for me, it's a question of civil liberties. How do you see the slow erosion of civil liberties, and where do you think this is heading? Because I'm deeply concerned about this. I'm concerned about free speech. I'm concerned about people's right to publish and to say what they think and to go and demonstrate the way that they want. But what do you think about this? Where are we headed in the US?
Most people think about the violations and they think about World War II. You have Hitlers and Mussolinis and you have Stalin, and they violate and kill their citizens and all that. But one thing that concerns me the most, because I believe there'll be a transition, and that is corporatism. And I think that is running rampant, because the corporatism where the government becomes a partner of the big corporation, it's almost impossible to avoid. Even the things that you can get, usually there's a corporations working with the government. You can't get the function done unless you work with them. But I think that is a problem, because Mises was very clear on his understanding of this, that corporatism leads to more and more authoritarianism, and it is the seeds being sowed for a more fascist state. He didn't predict that all of a sudden you would have Hitler pop up and organize it. You're going to get people very much engaged in corporation. So corporatism is, and a lot of people, rightfully criticize the system that we have. Well, it helps the corporation, it helps the rich people, which is true. It's designed that way. And who has to pay? The people who lose the value of the currency. Their inflation rates are much higher. They're the ones who get drafted. And then there's more violence. And right now, it's the seed of what's going on there. There is more street violence and more anger. Just compared to the short period of time that it's been since I was in Congress, I think it would be worse right now. I always felt that as long as I stuck to my guns, they knew who I was, they knew how I was going to vote. It was almost automatic, and they sort of left me alone. They didn't come bugging me at all, and the lobbyists didn't come, so it was different. But I think it's different now, especially with this current administration and the combination. Already you see some people benefiting by some of these changes financially, on what the government does and how the government sets it up, and the corporations and the new technology. Oh, you can't have this done without the help of the government. So you have new technology, more corporation, but it's always partnership with the government. And I think that gets worse all the time, and eventually will be an authoritarian system. We have a lot of that now, but it'll probably get much worse, and that's where the violation of civil liberties will come. But people are very, very annoyed about it. An example of where we overstepped the line, but maybe took a short step back, was with COVID. I mean, just look at the horrors of what came out of COVID, except the good part was it woke up a couple people and finally say, this is enough. What do you do this? You mean I can't even walk outside and walk around my yard? And, it became crazy. And that's an example of how the authoritarians work. And I'm amazed how far they went. There's been improvement, obviously, because the people finally got upset. So my goal is talking to the people who are annoyed, but they don't know what to do, and they worry that, well, that takes too many people. No, it takes leadership. The founders were probably 20% or less of the revolutionists, for our own country, and they led the charge. They led it, and you had to have intellectual leaders, but in the meantime, you have to have a consensus of people agreeing. So some of these people say, talking back again to COVID, you couldn't have a meeting and have 500 people there, but they're unhappy. So the consensus is do that, but somebody brought them there and told them why, gave them an explanation why we shouldn't be doing these things, why we shouldn't be keeping to feed the industrialists to the amount of money they're going to make over the war, the weapons industry, and on and on. It's that thing. The growth of the corporatist movement, where governments and corporations become partners, is very dangerous. And that's where I think the danger is, because it's created this dissension. The rich has been made richer, the poor have been made poorer. People say, oh, you sound like a radical leftist. Well, no, but I think it's the truth. I think they may say the same thing, but for different reasons. I see it in a way that it is a result of the monetary system and allowing the federal government to make deals with a lot of the lobbyists.
Speaking of lobbyists, I want to ask you, we have the elephant in the room these days that has been all over the media. In fact, everyone's talking about it everywhere, which is we had the recent resignation of Joe Kent from the National Counterterrorism Center. And in Joe Kent's own words, he was convinced that Israel dragged the US into this war, and that it was Israel's malign influence on our politics and in our Congress and in our government structures that has led to this. I want to ask you, from your experience on Capitol Hill, did you experience AIPAC? Did you experience the Israel lobby? What was it in your perspective? You mentioned briefly that many lobbyists didn't visit you. Did they attempt to? And what did you see? What kind of malign influences did you see trying to steer US policy?
Well, it was subtle. They knew where I stood. I would not become a chairman of a committee, and that sort of thing. And I wasn't looking for a fight. I was looking for just to speak my piece and leave a record. And so it wasn't, that bad. for me personally, but I still think that's worse. And I think, see, the one thing they think that what we if you have a position where you want to, back off on all these freebies for Israel and all the weaponry and lives that we invest and support of all the wars, so many of the wars in the Middle East are designed. But the whole thing is they're designed that way. But I think that that the easy answer for me is everybody, all countries should be treated the same. If why should anybody get any special privileges? That generates dissension. So I would say that we should treat Israel fairly and the same, which means I don't believe in foreign policy. I don't believe in messing in the internal affairs of other nations. And I think that's what we should do with Israel. And, you hate Israel. You're an anti-Semite. You won't do this. You won't sacrifice to help the Israelis. No, but they might be a free country. Who knows long term? Maybe the treatment of Israel as it has been now especially these last decade or so, I can visualize where this might turn out to be a negative for Israel, because what happens, you say, well, no, they will always get support because they're so powerful. But what if we want to and we don't have any money? And everybody's worried about something else, and they could end up, there's a lot of oil around them, but they probably don't have enough oil to run what they do. So I would say treat everybody equally, which means that you should treat Israel like our best friend and like we want others to act. And I think that we'd be much better off than having any special privileges and money and support that way and getting involved in wars for their benefit, not for the benefit of our national security.
And in that way, the next question would be, what do you think the U.S. relationship should be, for example, with the countries that the U.S. always maligns as major adversaries or worse enemies, for example, Russia, China, and other countries? Should we cooperate? Should we have this kind of, new Cold War scenario? What is you said treat all countries equally, and I agree with that. I believe in that, that sort of multipolar world that's developing. But how do you think the U.S., in your estimation, should approach these other countries?
Well, we certainly improved our relationship with China, even though there are people now still think China is the biggest enemy ever. But what about, when everybody during World War II and in that area, it was all this fighting. I love the fact, probably 1989 and 1990 when the Cold War ended, and good things happened. We started trading. Russia was selling oil to Europeans. Then some other people who didn't like this company, and part of us going in there and participating in a coup in Ukraine, we create these problems. But I think trade is the answer. I believe that Bastiat was right. He says if goods and services don't cross borders, armies will, and that's what we're doing now. And all this excitement and the conversion immediately, almost the entire economic community, the acceptance of sanctions and tariffs and controls and bribes and the one thing is how do we do all this? Well, we give them money and tell them what to do, and if they don't do what we want, we take away their money. I mean, you shouldn't even be involved. So what are you going to do with all that mess in the Middle East? My answer was just come home. And what would happen? Well, what would happen if you stayed? There's so many times we stayed in a lot longer. We tried to prevent that mess in Iraq, and how many people died for that? And we're still, around there, but it took a long time for actually getting our troops out of there, and which is not total. And that war was considered 10 years. Then we go into Afghanistan. Did we learn a lesson of history? I mean, it wasn't just the Russians that, you made so many mistakes. It was other times. When I was in the Air Force, I was visiting over that way, and we were on the border of Afghanistan, and some more experienced military people were with me, and they said, "Ron, look up there," and the mountains were so barren, and they said, "You know what? There's a lot of people up there, and there's a lot of tribes up there." And they said they've never been conquered. But I was looking at this place at the time, and I think that was when the Russians were still, involved there. But it just doesn't make any sense. So that makes you think, well, how do you change that? You don't change it with guns and bullets. You have to change it with ideology. You have to change it with getting the people who are instinctively, attracted to liberty and taking care of their own business, if they can be convinced that they're better off that way. And most people realize it, but sometimes they don't even have a choice. But they're going to have a choice eventually on whether they're going to put up with this, because this system undermines it, and people in this country are getting poorer. There are bad statistics coming that the end stages are here, and it's usually done with monetary systems, and the idea that when our central bank took over the monetary system, the gold was worth $20. Now it did hit at $6,000, and it will again. It's going to go higher. That's what happens, because there's no control anymore, because they've given up on the principles of liberty. I was excited about campaigning because I have found that young people, would listen more intently than some of the others who had, especially, like say, in Washington, D.C., who's been around the politics, and success came by kowtowing to the lobbyists. They'll get you your money, and they'll get you your promotions and your committee work. And that's the wrong place to be. The solution is not in Washington. It's outside of Washington, because if you don't like what the Congresses do, why do you keep sending people there? And they do. We keep sending the same people. And then if you stand up and don't go along with it, oh, you're committing treason. You won't do what the president tells you to do. So, but we're nearing a climactic end to this, but this could linger. It could go on for years to go, but it's not going to be solved by getting 10, 20, 30, or even 50 new members of Congress. That's not going to do it. They're not going to change it by all of a sudden starting to cut back on spending. If you started cutting back on food stamps for the poor or food stamps for the rich, the violence would get much, much worse, because it would be, somebody will be disgruntled, then they will blame the officials, and that's when you have civil strife. But we've been seeing a little bit of that in these last several years. Look at our streets. Our streets have just been bombarded with all the breakdown of law and order. So I think that's going to continue to get worse. But the answers are not difficult. Just like I said, they say, well, what would you do about the Middle East? I said, I'd just come home. Walked in. Why can't we just walk out? Because we're not going to win the war. We may say we won the war, but we're not going to. Nobody really wins the war. How about the people who die that have been forced to fight the wars? So, to me, it's a philosophic issue, and I believe that our universities have contributed tremendously to this misunderstanding of economic policy and the acceptance of an interventionist foreign policy.
Dr. Ron Paul, as always, it was a pleasure to have you on the program. And for me, especially, I want to thank you for your many decades of service, and, of course, your forceful voice for reason and for a more sane foreign policy, domestic policy, and economic policy. Thank you again, my good sir. Hope to have you on the program again soon. And stay healthy, stay well. We hope your voice continues for many more years.
Thank you, Chris. Good to be with you.
Good to be with you. Now, of course, another distinguished guest who needs no introduction to our program. He's made an appearance a few times before. Mr. Scott Horton, welcome to the show, my good sir. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. Pretty tough
Thank
act
you.
to follow, the greatest American that ever lived. Thanks a lot. Could
No,
have had
no,
me
see,
introduce him, you know.
you two are a package deal. That's why I had to bring you both. I had to bring you both on. So thank you so much for joining the program. And
Happy to be here.
I'd love to get started. You've been a very important voice for Reason in terms of foreign policy, also in terms of ending these forever wars that have been going on. I want to ask you, what do you make of what we're seeing the past 4 weeks? What's going on, and where do you think things are headed at this point?
Well, it's terrible. It's literally chaos, and the endpoint is completely undetermined. I mean, it's the biggest damn idiot thing to do. There's a famous quote from oh hell, I don't know, some fancy French guy a long time ago. Eric Margolyes used to quote it all the time. I think it was Talleyrand talking about some stupid thing that Napoleon Bonaparte did. And he said it was worse than a crime. It was a mistake. And so I should probably like look that up or something and get my quote right. But anyway, the point being, that's what Eric Margolyes says about a lot of these things. And I'm sure I should probably call him and get the quote from him firsthand. I'm sure it's what he would say about this one. It's just like, and there are so many of these, in the way I tell the Middle East stories, it's really one event causes the next, causes the next, causes the next. And we really just need to stop at some point because we keep kicking down dominoes and then each crisis becomes the excuse for more intervention. But at the same time, that emphasis on the word excuse rather than reason. In other words, there are many of these events that have taken place through these same years where they're just completely unforced errors. I mean, the most obvious of this would be, well, for many of God, but like Iraq War II, Obama in Libya, and for that matter in Syria, and this thing where it's just kicking off an entire new direction of violent conflict and chaos where you just did not have to, where there was just nothing going on in the world that necessitated it. And I mean, this is George W. Bush leveled really, really bad. Bill Clinton lied us into war in Kosovo to break Kosovo, or against Serbia, to break off Kosovo from what was left of Yugoslavia at that time. It was horrible. He killed thousands of people. He lied his ass off. He took Al-Qaeda's side and all that. And like, as evil as it was, and look, it's had a lot of diplomatic implications and things as well, I guess. But compared to like Iraq War II, or now this war, or really Obama when he backed Al-Qaeda in Syria and that blew up into the rise of the Caliphate, Islamic State, ISIS state. I mean, Trump was really right. Obama did build that. Then he also launched the war. It was in 2014. He launched the war to blow it back up again. It was such a disaster. So this is on that level. This is on the level of Obama building the dang ISIS caliphate and then having to launch Iraq War III to go blow it back up again. And what was he doing at that time? He built the caliphate to spite Iran because he was mad that George W. Bush put Iran's best friends in power in Baghdad in the war before. And then he built the caliphate up so big that, oops, that was an embarrassment. And then what did he do? He allied with Iran and their friends in Iraq again to destroy it again. Right. And then, so they're still upset that everything that they've done has empowered Iran. And so this is the solution to that. Go ahead and cut the head off the snake or whatever, this kind of argument. It won't be done until it's done. And there's no point in stopping short of getting the terror masters in Tehran, as Michael Ledeen, the old neoconservative hawk, used to put it in the Bush years. And so Trump let himself get talked into this primarily by the Israelis and their lobby. I'm a little bit dubious about the whole blackmail claim. Oh, Netanyahu swore he was just going to go no matter what. And so Trump had no choice but to go along with him. But it's still true that it was Netanyahu that convinced him to do it. So whatever. man. I mean, blame is a quality, not a quantity. So you just use your own sort of estimation about who you want to blame to what percent, if you want to put a number on it. But that's what happened here was the leader of Israel convinced the leader of America to go ahead and do this thing. And as far as what happens next, I don't know. I mean, I could see possibilities where everybody ramps down. I mean, if you're the Iranians and look, the conservative old Ayatollah is dead. Who knows how radical the kooks are who have replaced him now. But the old Ayatollah would have found a way to ramp down if America was really willing to ramp down, probably. And Trump wants a way out of this. He doesn't want a prolonged thing that looks more and more like a big dumb error the whole time. You know what I mean? And is like a pie in his face, kind of make him look stupid kind of deal when he said it was supposed to be so easy. So I could see, look, if cooler heads were there, there's a way out of this, right? As far as, security guarantees and withdrawal of forces and whatever, I don't know. But I can also see this thing getting very bad. I saw a wise person on Twitter said, hey, look, I'm just tweeting this for no reason whatsoever, but just so you know that Saddam Hussein's Iraq attacked Iran in September of 1980. And then Iran had retaken all of that territory by the beginning of 1983. And then they refused to negotiate till 1988 because they wanted to keep fighting and teach Saddam Hussein a lesson, even while he's attacking them with chemical weapons provided by the United States and our allies. Well, bought by the United States and manufactured by Saddam and by European companies. But anyway, and with American satellite info to help him target Iranian forces with. And they still were like, yeah, so we're going to heaven anyway, and kept fighting. I mean, so, and many analysts much smarter than me have said, look, it makes sense to me what they say, that the sort of symbolic retaliations that we saw after the Soleimani strike and after the attacks last June. I mean, they hit Israel for real, but they only hit an American base in Qatar in a symbolic way. And even warned, as Trump praised them and thanked them on Truth Social. Thanks for calling ahead and telling us about the missiles you were sending, which is just, we're not pacifists. Here's an open hand something just to save the slightest bit of face. But knowing that they're completely overmatched, but that once the Americans have decided to go this far, even though they weren't really doing anything to pick the fight on their end at all, that now their doctrine has to change from that. And especially they killed the Ayatollah himself. So now it's changed from that to they have to teach the empire a real lesson here before they stop. And I really fear that that's true. I don't know that that's right, but it makes sense that, and geez, you might think they'd have learned some kind of lesson when you reflect on the fact that they've lost all 13 bases in the region. It's Justin Logan from Cato was tweeting this morning. What is a military base in the region if you can't fight from it? You might have thought that our air base in Qatar, our Navy base in Bahrain, our Army and air bases in Kuwait and in Saudi, that all of them gave us some kind of military advantage in the region. Actually, nope, got to skedaddle and hightail it out of there as they crater all the runways and, damage the ports, hit all the important radar stations, and our guys had to leave. Thank goodness they didn't carpet bomb the barracks and kill as many guys as they could. They were more specific in their targeting there. But they have rendered all 13 American bases in the region uninhabitable as of right now, as of a couple of weeks ago. So this is, for all the people going, oh yeah, why won't you admit what a great success this is at setting the people of Iran free and determine, American regional dominance? Yeah, sure doesn't look like that to me. And by the way, the Americans, and I'm not sure who all my audience is here, but whatever, no matter who you are, so that you can understand. To Washington, D.C., when I say the Americans, I mean the foreign policy establishment in Washington and New York and Tel Aviv. To them, America is Superman. America is like the star of the high school baseball team who beats up the bully. The bully goes around picking on the weak kids. And then the star of the baseball team goes and says, pick on someone your own size and beats that bully up, right? So that's what the American government always believes it is and is doing, and always dress everything they do in that kind of, even if we're the aggressor, still, it's always in defense of someone else, that kind of thing. And they can never see themselves as the bully. And in fact, they often use this metaphor about how everyone else is always Hitler, the schoolyard bully and or Adolf Hitler. And the only way to stop a guy like that is you have to fight him. You cannot appease anyone ever, because that would be just like Neville Chamberlain appeasing Adolf Hitler before the Second World War. And that was the worst thing anybody ever did. And so no one can ever do that. What you have to do is and they always mix their metaphor, you have to either be Churchill and carpet bomb Germany, or you have to punch the schoolyard bully in the nose. That's what they all say, because they're all a bunch of big fat dorks, right? Who always had to be rescued by the star of the baseball team is really what's going on in that analogy. And so they go, you got to punch the bully in the nose, and that's what'll make them stop. But then look what happens when Iran punches the bully in the nose. They go, we're not the bully, we're the hero. This isn't going to make us stop. This is just going to make us bomb you even harder than before. So it just goes to show that the kind of, military, or I guess what passes for strategic thinking or geopolitical thinking, and the results of these wars, what passes for their analysis in Washington, it sure doesn't apply to them when anybody else tries it on us. Vladimir Putin said the same thing. He said, in America, they always cite Neville Chamberlain at Munich, where he tried to compromise with Hitler, right? Well, Putin gave the exact same sort of melodramatic retelling of the moral example thing. And only in his story, it's Molotov meeting with Ribbentrop and doing the Hitler-Stalin pact, trying to appease the fascist enemy. And that didn't work. And the Nazis ended up attacking the Soviet Union anyway 2 years later. And they lost millions of people, millions and millions, tens of millions of people. And so Putin says, the lesson is you never appease the evil fascist. You always got to punch them in the nose. You always got to fight. So they all say this. They all talk essentially like they're school kids. None of them are ever, and I'm afraid they really, that's how they explain themselves all the time. So I believe that is how they really see it. You know what I mean? That's as simple and stupid and wrong as it obviously is.
I want to ask you. You had made you alluded to it, and I want to go a little bit deeper. So we had the resignation of Joe Kent. I asked Dr. Ron Paul, and I want your opinion as well. Yeah. And he put the blame squarely in Israel's lap. That they're the one who basically dragged Donald Trump and the U.S. into this. They're the malign influence. All these wars are Israel's wars. Of course, my co-host and friend Sarah. Her opinion was, look, the U.S. is not like a puppy dog. We're talking about a major empire here in world history. They make their own decisions too, and this was already part of their plans. We had PNAC, we had how many neocons up and down the line talking about these various issues over the decades. So I want you to kind of break down how you see Israel's role, but also how you see U.S. responsibility in this all as well.
Yeah. Sure. Okay. Well, a couple of things there. First of all, as anyone can see, Donald Trump is the man in that chair behind that desk, not anybody else. He's the only one who gets to call these shots. And so nobody should, be under any illusions otherwise. But when you talk about the neoconservatives, who are the neoconservatives? The Project for a New American Century, for example, that you mentioned there. They're the vanguard of the Israel lobby in the United States of America. That's who they are. They're Netanyahu's guys. They're Israel's fifth column, aka the War Party. And they're the same guys. You see them on Twitter all day long. Look, there's Eli Lake and there's Michael Rubin. And there's, actually not Bill Kristol this time, which is funny, but I don't know if he's being sincere or not. I tend to doubt that's even possible. But essentially, you see a lot of the same old hawks from back then are out pushing for this. And we know why. And it's because they're a bunch of Likudniks. And so the neoconservatives, by the way, I'll try to clear this up in a short fashion rather than the long version. But people misuse this term, and I'm not mad at them. But people just say, he's a neocon, you're a neocon, that's a neocon. I used to be a neocon, things like that, right? Because they just think neocon means hawk, basically, right? Foreign policy, tough guy, whatever. But that's not really right. The neoconservatives is really a small group of guys, about 100 of them or so, and 2 or 3 generations of them now. And they're essentially a few different strains of descendants of the Trotskyites. And so there was a group of them under Norman Podhoretz and Irving Kristol and their children and Commentary Magazine and all that. There was a whole gaggle of them at the National Review. There were a bunch of them who studied under Leo Strauss at the University of Chicago, and Strauss and his buddy Wohlstetter were both at least somewhat Trotskyoid in their previous past. And then you had Max Schachmann, who was a famous Trotskyite devotee. And so what we call the neoconservatives, they came from that Trotskyite left, which is, please forgive me, but for lack of a better term, they're like right-wing communists, basically. They hated Stalin because Stalin had killed Trotsky and kicked him out. And plus, they were Americans. So after the Second World War, they all took America's side in the Cold War. And in fact, they were reliably anti-Soviet, pro-Cold War, which was what gave them such a prominent place in the conservative movement later, was they came in, they essentially left the Democratic Party and became Reaganites at the dawn of the 1980s. Because that was where the militarism was. And their only interest really was in protecting Israel. And so a lot of them, essentially, they divided the movement in half, or even like maybe whatever fractions. Some of them went into government service as the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Arms Control and Nonproliferation, or whatever kind of rank, down in the bowels of the Pentagon as civilian appointees. And then others of them worked, of course, at the National Review. And Bill Kristol founded the Weekly Standard. And then they had taken over the Heritage and Hudson Institutes. I'm not sure if they created Hudson. I think they took it over along with the American Enterprise Institute. And then they created a whole forest of other think tanks, such as the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, the Center for Security Policy, the Project for a New American Century, as you mentioned, and the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Boy, I always let those guys off the hook for some reason. Whenever I cite that wrote, I always forget Dubowitz and what's his name, Cliff May, and those other criminals over there at FDD. And anyway, so these guys are not all of them ex-communists, but virtually all of them are like ex-Cold War Democrats. They come like later generations of the thing. They're like ex-Cold War Democrats. And the main reason, well, one of the main reasons that they are attracted to the right for its militarism when it's being militaristic, and that's what made them neoconservatives. They're new conservatives. Not just, that doesn't mean conservatives nowadays. It means these guys used to be communists. Now they're new conservatives, right? Or they used to be Cold War Democrats. Now they're new conservatives. So, and then these are the men that Dick Cheney and George Bush hired to do Iraq War II. Famously and hugely importantly, they hired, like, I'm going to say 15 of them to run defense and state and the vice president's office and the National Security Council. And they're the ones that did the Iraq War. They laundered the lies and they came up with the strategy. And they're the ones that told idiot W. Bush, the man in the chair behind the desk, the only one truly responsible for pulling the trigger, but still, yes, sir, boss, you're a brilliant genius. This is a great idea. We gamed it out and it's going to be great. And yeah, because that was what Benjamin Netanyahu wanted. And that was Likud party doctrine. And the American neoconservatives' role in America is basically getting their dirty work done. And then the rest of the Israel lobby, I'll support it too. There's an excellent essay. You can read it at antiwar.com if you can't find it anywhere else. It's called The Israel Lobby and American Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt. Just type that in with antiwar.com. You'll find it. And then, of course, they turned it into a book. And they document this in great deal. I also document it as well in my book, Enough Already. The American Israel Public Affairs Committee explicitly instructed their membership to lobby for the war. They had it in their briefing book. Here's what to tell Congress. We have to do this because of the threat to Israel and the threat of the weapons and all of this stuff. And so much more. But basically, yeah. So, and then if you go to Syria, even before I get to the current war, if you go to Syria, and I demonstrate this in the book, in my book Enough Already as well. By then, the war party had been whittled down quite a bit from just everybody who was, whooping to get on board with W. Bush in the bandwagon in 2003. And it was much smaller, and it was just the Israel lobby. It was just Zionists, leading the charge across the board on the thing. And in fact, you might remember, maybe not, but I remember, it's a pretty small, trivial detail to most maybe, but in the summer of 13. It was late August, early September, was when there was the first major fake sarin attack in the outskirts of Damascus, in Ghouta, in the suburbs of Damascus. And they almost invaded the country in the name of it. And there was a big push for that by the war party. And at one point, Barack Obama, I joked at the time that he was kind of jerking their chain and being cynical about it, but probably not. He said, listen, I really need help. So I urge all the think tanks and all the influential people inside the foreign policy establishment to do everything you can to help me drum up support for this. And then it was like all crickets except for AIPAC and CSP and JINSA and AEI and the rest of the neoconservative faction. And, their major, house organs like the Atlantic or whatever, where they're writing this. And nobody else is for it. It was just the Israel lobby. And I joked at the time even that it was like he kind of tricked them into doing that so that they'd be like, if you picture Will Ferrell in Old School where he's all drunk streaking down the street naked and he thinks that he's got a whole crowd behind him and he's like, come on guys, we're going to get him. Yeah. And then but there's no one. He's just by himself out there. That they were really left exposed, that there's no one who wants America to overthrow the Ba'athists in favor of Al-Qaeda, except for who? The Likudniks of the United States, Israel's fifth column in the United States. That's who it is. Nobody else wants to do this. And you could say Assad's a butcher. You couldn't possibly exaggerate. Yeah, he was a butcher, but only because America and our allies were supporting bin Ladenite suicide bomber, head chopper mercenaries to destroy his country and overthrow it, which by 2024, they finally succeeded in doing. They accidentally, sort of, kind of on purpose, created the caliphate. They only got upset because they sacked Western Iraq instead of Eastern Syria, like in the blueprint drawn up over at the think tanks. So anyway, and then on the current war, it's just no secret at all. There's a great, in fact, speaking of Mearsheimer and Walt, Stephen Walt has a great Mearsheimer's beating this drum on the YouTubes every day. You can see him. But Walt has a great new piece at foreignpolicy.com about how, it's the Israel lobby that did this all right. And now that it's already turning out to be not all that they promised, they're already kind of slithering away and trying to avoid their responsibility. But let's go ahead and take note of who has been pushing for this thing so hard. And it is, in their own words and their own names, of course, Netanyahu and Mark Dubowitz, Ted Cruz and Lindsey Graham, Israeli agents. And it's not so much the neoconservatives now, although you can find them on Twitter and things like that. There are no actual card-carrying neocons in the Trump government right now. In the previous administration, Elliot Abrams was there at least. People say Rubio's a neocon, but again, misunderstanding, overly broad use of that term. He's a turd and he's a hawk, and he's a traitor, but that doesn't make him a neoconservative. Otherwise, you'd have been reading him over at Commentary Magazine all these years or whatever, if you understand my meaning.
Exactly. John Bolton was there in the first administration.
Well, and Bolton's not a neocon. See, Bolton was never any kind of Democrat or leftist. He's a lifelong kind of Barry Goldwater / Ronald Reagan conservative. Now,
but he's a PNAC guy, right? He's a PNAC guy from the original time.
I'm not certain if he signed on the PNAC thing, but probably. But so did a lot of guys actually who weren't literal members of the neoconservative sect.
Yeah, of course. There's some overlap with some other groups and people, for sure.
Sure, yeah. And John Bolton is definitely, he's the type who is very often mistakenly conflated with the neoconservatives because he's very much a fellow traveler with them in a way that, like, see, Rubio would agree with Bolton about everything probably by and large, but doesn't have that close relationship with the Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz sect the way that Bolton can claim,
And actually, one of the things that's interesting is imagine these two kind of factions, they're also competing interests over sort of who supports which opposition for Iran. For example, Bolton, Pompeo, even the former vice president under Trump 1, right? All these guys are out there campaigning for the Mujahideen Khalq, the People's Mujahideen of Iran based in Albania, Rajavi's cult. And you have other guys campaigning for Rudy Giuliani is also in that mix. And then you also have, for example, people campaigning, well, a little bit more just pro-Israel people totally campaigning for Pahlavi. So it's also interesting the lines here over who is supporting who in terms of the opposition.
Yeah. Well, and by the way, God dang, I mean, I'm sorry, just even think about that question. how completely preposterous it is that any faction supports either of those factions to do anything.
So
You could
crazy.
drop every last monarchist and every last MEK cultist right into government, I don't know, IRGC headquarters or whatever that they're supposed to take over there, the parliament building, whatever it is. If you want to, the war party wants to daydream that they could seize that would give them control over that country. I dare you to try it. Take the whole NCRI over there and see what they get. I mean, the whole thing is completely preposterous. The only other armed factions that they can even daydream about using are PJAK, the Kurdish communists, which of course would only rally every other sect in the country together against that, and which I have no real reason to believe that the average Iranian Kurd sides with those PKK style commies at all. Just because they're an armed group doesn't mean much, unless and even if they have broad support, well, that's just tough. Kurdistan is pentasected by 5 nations who aren't giving up their territory, and that does suck very bad for them, but it's not my problem. And so if there's a minority of Kurds in northwest Iran who would like to leave and join with their countrymen in a state of their own someday or whatever, best of luck to them. But certainly we should not be supporting anything like that, and it would be bound to work only against their interest if we did help them in any way. But they're used to getting screwed by the United States, the Kurds. And then there's Jandala. They're the Baluchi bin Ladenite suicide bomber types who like to cut off people's heads and do suicide attacks. And then, of course, there's ISIS, who have done suicide attacks, including in Tehran at the Ayatollah Khomeini's tomb, if you remember back a few years ago. So who else you got? You got the monarchists, you got the MEK cult, you got the Kurdish communists, and you got the Baluchi bin Ladenites. I wonder how anyone in Iran could prefer their same old, tired, old theocratic regime compared to American and Israeli imported mercenary violence, along with the airstrikes. And by the way, here's the thing. I'm an American. I really, I'm sympathetic to the truth. And I'm sympathetic to innocent civilians wherever they are. You know what I mean? But I got no special favor for Iran. I'm not sitting here trying to take Iran's side against my country's side. I'm on my country's side. But it's just my government is not on my country's side. My government's doing the wrong thing, and it's doing the wrong thing to other people, and it's my job to be opposed to that. So it's not a simple matter of who lives where and all that. But it's not any particular point I'm trying to score against my country. I just want to point out, the reality for Americans who watch this to understand of what it must look like from another point of view. And the most obvious kind of example that jumped out to me was the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor, which Trump himself made the comparison to the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor. But imagine Americans, and I know for right-wing libertarian types like me, there's an inside joke here, but broadly speaking, of the American people, imagine if at Pearl Harbor they had not only sank the ships full of soldiers and sailors, who many of whom drown over a long period of time down there in horror show, but had also hit a school full of all of their little girls. All those sailors' little girls went to school, and they died on the first day in the Pearl Harbor attack that they had bombed and killed. An Oklahoma City bombing worth of all children, virtually all children, 175. And they killed FDR, the 4-time elected president of the United States. I guess he got elected the 4th time in the war, but the thrice elected president, the first time any president had run for a 3rd term, had dared, and he won and was highly revered. I mean, people put pictures of him over their fireplaces and stuff, like I got Ron Paul. And imagine if the Japanese had done Pearl Harbor, and including in that, had killed a school full of little girls and had killed FDR and his whole cabinet. I mean, We'd have got the nukes together faster. We'd have ignored Europe and we'd have gone straight to the Pacific. There would have been much worse hell to pay than that. And the legend of Pearl Harbor now would be 5 times what it already is. Imagine that. And that's what really happened here. That's what that's what the US government really did to these people. Killed not just, and it'd be like, and I know for Protestants, this isn't your thing, but you can understand what I mean. If America was all a Catholic country and the Pope was the president too, and that was who they killed. FDR was the Pope and the thrice elected president. And they attacked our base and killed our bravest, most valiant sailors, slaughtered their daughters at their school, killed FDR and his whole cabinet. I mean, we'd still be upset. We probably would have never even made a peace with Japan after. We probably have just nuked the whole country.
No, I think you're spot on. I think you're spot on.
And I'm not trying to justify any Iranian violence back or any terrorism or anything like that. I'm not. That's the whole point. Killing civilians is wrong. No one should agree with Bill Clinton and bin Laden that you can do things like this to people. You cannot. That's the whole point. This is just, and whatever. If they hadn't killed the Ayatollah and they hadn't killed the girls at the school, it would also be wrong. But
of course,
it's as Aldous Huxley said, violent and destructive means determine violent and destructive ends. In other words, there's no right way to do this. You start a war, of course you kill a bunch of little girls. Of course you drive the people into the arms of the regime you despise. Of course they close the goddamn Straits of Hormuz. What are you, stupid? No,
you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And listen, we're at the possible turning point here of boots on the ground. They're saying 82nd, they're saying the Marines, they're saying some special operators. I don't know where we go from here, but if they do put boots on the ground, very briefly, because I know you have to head out.
Oh my God, I'm sorry. I do have to go, man. I'm late.
Go.
I'm so sorry, man. Next time.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, man. Take care.
Absolutely. A pleasure. So, of course, I mean, to conclude with, these two gentlemen, these two amazing Americans, it's a very, very dangerous time. The possibility of boots on the ground in the next week or so, possibly the next 2 or 3, depending on the deployment of troops in the region and the bringing of the various battalions and brigades. It's very concerning, everyone. It's very concerning. We're going to bring it all to you here live. I'm currently traveling, speaking to you all from another country, of course, and look forward to our ongoing work. Hopefully, in the coming 2 weeks, I will be bringing to you some bombshell stories and very important footage. And I hope that we can continue to show the truth to the American people, to continue to try to turn down the tension, to ratchet back from this edge of the abyss that we're now on. Another endless war, another billions and trillions of dollars spent for killing civilians, for destroying a country, and for immiserating an entire region. Not to mention, today, people are now discussing there could be refugees, there could be migrants again, another crisis for Europe and surrounding nations. This is on the precipice of a global catastrophe, not only economically, but also politically, socially. And I think that we need to understand that and stay tuned here on this channel. Stay tuned to us at DD Geopolitics. If you're not following DD Geopolitics, please go now. Like, comment, subscribe, share. Also on my channel, Christopher Helali Official on YouTube, X, Instagram, TikTok, wherever you find us, please like, comment, subscribe, get involved. We're a small community. We've got to be vocal. We got to be active, and we got to continue to try to bring some sane foreign policy, some sane general just politics to our world, especially to the United States. So thank you all again for a wonderful night. It was a real pleasure. I couldn't see all the comments that were happening live, but I'll make sure to go back and read them all. Thank you all again. Real pleasure. Wishing you all the best. See you soon. Take care, everyone.